Yeah, thanks for that great introduction. Thanks also to the organizers for putting together a great event and including me in it, which I'm excited to be a part of. As Phil just said, so Michael Ringel, I'm a managing director and senior partner at BCG. I'm also on the board of Evolution Foundation US and AFAR, which is the American Federation of Aging Research. And actually, I'm going to start with something that's been on my mind since I flew in yesterday, which is just by show of hands, how many of you traveled at least one time zone to get here? Oh, wow, okay. Almost everyone. And probably all those that are still sleeping in, 100% of them are feeling the effects of this classic result, which is the effect of circadian rhythm disruption on health span and lifespan. So Davidson and colleagues took mice, and they essentially flew them once a week, either 6 hours east or 6 hours west. Someone asked me how they got the mice to sit still in the planes and whether there's peanuts and movies involved. I don't think they actually flew the mice. They just changed the daylight cycle on them. And what they found was for young mice, there was no impact. But for old mice, you can see the diagram they published here. They didn't put error bars on this, but they made the assertion that flying east was not so good for you. It increased mortality. And as someone who flies all the time, I've been in consulting now for over 25 years, I'm still looking for the solution to this, so if anyone has it, please let me know. The only thing I can come up with is predicated on it's easier to force yourself awake when you're not, when you're tired than it is to force yourself asleep when you're not tired. And so when I fly east, I try to get up early that morning, and fly west, I stay up late that night, which is a good excuse to stay at the bar, leaving here. But it's definitely not a perfect solution. Okay, enough about that. What I really want to talk to you about are these 4 things, which is number one, that life and health are immensely valuable, maybe immeasurably so, but certainly immensely. That the major way, and really the only way, to extend them from where we are now has to be through geroscience. Number 3, that those 2 facts together actually create an enormous opportunity. And biotechs are going to be the ones that really take advantage of that. And number 4 is if you're an entrepreneur in this field or an investor, it is definitely not too late to get in. So I'm going to go through each of these in order. I'm going to start with the first one, which for people in this room probably isn't a shocking assertion. But interestingly, when you ask people about work in geroscience, one of the main things they raise a concern about is that it's going to harm the economy. It's actually the number 2 social concern that people raise. And the reason why they think that geroscience is going to harm the economy is twofold. So on the left, they think, oh, lots of old people, that means drawing down more entitlements. This is US data, but it generalizes to other jurisdictions. The black line is the percentage of the population that is 65 and up. And the colorful diagram there is spend on entitlements, particularly the green, which is spend on healthcare, and you can see they go up together. Exacerbating that is the point on the right-hand side of the page, which is not only are older people drawing down more entitlements, but they're contributing less to the economy. They're much less likely to be working. They spend less as consumers. And so you see, again, this is US data, an inverse correlation. Each bubble here now is a state. And the x-axis is percent of the population that's over 60. And the y-axis is GDP growth. So there's an inverse correlation between those 2. This is the so-called gray wave that many economies in the West are starting to face. Japan at the forefront, Europe in between, and the US a bit behind, but all of us are going to be facing it. The issue is people are actually 180 degrees wrong in thinking that geroscience exacerbates the gray wave. It actually solves the gray wave. And a lot of very serious economists have looked at this. They've all come to the same conclusion. So the first is Murphy and Topol at University of Chicago. They wrote a National Bureau of Economics research paper, which is like I don't know how much economics literature, but that's like a gold standard. It's like a Nature paper for economics. or science. And what they did is they looked retrospectively at the period 1970 to 2000 and showed that the amount of gains were staggering. Trillions of dollars a year benefit to the economy by the gains that we've already had in lifespan and health span. Second, in the middle, Goldman and colleagues used a model from Rand Corporation to model a really trivial forward-looking change. So here's what they modeled. There's a Kaplan-Meier curve, so human survival from age 50 outward. The blue line versus the purple line. If you can see the difference between those, you've passed the eye test. So they modeled a very small change, and moreover, not shown there, but they actually phased it in very slowly as well. So it took 20 years to move from the blue line to the purple line. Even this incredibly modest change was worth $7 trillion. And then lastly, Andrew Scott and colleagues at London Business School, also working with David Sinclair, who's a key researcher in this field, using Murphy and Topol's model, applied it to future looking. And they did a few different scenarios, but the one I'm going to show you is no change to lifespan, just a change in health span. They did a 10-year improvement in health span and calculated that was worth $367 trillion, which is an enormous number. It is meaningless to me. It's probably meaningless to many of you in the audience. So to kind of help contextualize that, the entire GDP of the world is 1/3 of that. So that's 3 times the annual GDP of the world. So there's an unbelievable amount of economic value in unlocking lifespan and health span. That's in addition to the moral value, which I think a lot of us are convinced of, but there is a strong business case here. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is around the science, which is geroscience is the only way to unlock that value. So why do I say that? So this is the Kaplan-Meier curve again for humans. This is how it's changed over roughly the 20th century. And you can see it improved a lot. Average lifespans went up a lot, largely through what you can see is called squaring of the curve here. But kind of 2 things are immediately obvious when you look at this. The first is the curve is now already pretty square, so there's not a lot more that you can go there. And the second is the maximum didn't change during this time. That's true no matter how much you spend. So here's a chart of healthcare spend per capita, and in this case, health-adjusted life expectancy by country. So this, a year in poor health counts as a little bit less than 100%, but you get the, same general idea if I did this in total life expectancy. Each dot is a country, and you can see that spending more is, it's hitting an asymptote. You can probably guess which dot is the one that's, way out on that end of the chart for you, right? But the key point is that it looks like there's an asymptote. And whenever you see something that looks like an asymptote, you have to ask, well, is there a natural limit that we're running up against? And the answer is yes, unfortunately. That is the limit. So Jay Olshansky and colleagues wrote a paper in Science now more than 30 years ago where they calculated that to improve average lifespan, you would have to have incredible reductions in mortality rate, 55% to reach 85, 70%, 90%. That's in the context of if you were to cure all major degenerative diseases, that would only be worth a 75% reduction in mortality rate. And so they concluded that what had driven the increases in life expectancy in the past in the developed world were done. That we were not going to see increases in life expectancy going forward. That was a controversial prediction in 1990. They have absolutely been borne out. In fact, not only has it not increased, in some cases it's decreased. It's decreased largely because of obesity and opioids. But by no means has it continued to press up in the way that it did during the 20th century. And so that you can see the quote on the right that they made. But that's not their actual quote. Their actual quote was, unless there is some new technology that fundamentally changes the way we address lifespan and health span. And then at the bottom, they go on to say, and we believe that such new technologies are going to be forthcoming. So super optimistic. Is there a reason for that optimism? So the way to think about that starts here, which is, so the number one risk factor for pretty much all these diseases, these major degenerative diseases, is age. So I've plotted here cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, diabetes, which are the four big scourges. But there are more than 100 other indications, diseases, that I could do the same chart for. They all go up with age, and they go up exponentially with age. Now, we haven't historically thought about the age you are as an intervention point for disease, because you live 1 year, you age 1 year. But if, in fact, it becomes possible to decouple chronological age and biological age, then this becomes an incredibly powerful intervention point to address not just lifespan, but health span, to address the incidence of disease, the burden of disease, and, going back to Geroscience, then to actually change the fundamental things that are limiting our lifespan. So if you can move where you are on this x-axis, you can change your burden of disease. It's the so-called Geroscience hypothesis. So is there any reason to believe that it's possible? It turns out that actually there's a lot of reason to believe it's possible. There's a lot of evidence that the rate of aging is an evolved and genetically regulated trait, and that implies that it could be malleable. So the first line of evidence is theory. So energy and resources are not infinite. Every organism has a choice of how it deploys its limited pool of resources between growth and reproduction on the one side and maintenance and repair on the other. Importantly, the optimum is set by what maximizes fitness, the long-run rate of growth of a line of descent. That is not your own lifespan. That is your looking forward at some distant future date, how many additional copies are there? That implies that for each species, there's going to be an optimum lifespan that maximizes that fitness that is not infinity. It is some number that's going to vary based on that species niche. That's exactly what we see in the real world in comparative biology. So now empirical data supporting theory. The colorful diagram on the top is the radiation of Pacific rockfish. This is a pretty new clade, so they evolved from a common ancestor just 8 million years ago, and they have evolved vastly different lifespans. So some of these species live 10 years, others live 200 years. Moreover, the differences between those species happen in ways exactly as we would predict based on the theory. So the lifespan varies based on depth and size, which correlate with risk of resource insecurity and risk of predation. So two key factors of extrinsic mortality. And the ones that have the lower extrinsic mortality have the longer intrinsic lifespan, as we would expect. On the bottom, that's true not just across species, but within species. So in eusocial insects, you can have a queen and a worker ant that have the same DNA, or 3/4 the same DNA. Just which genes are turned on and off, vastly different lifespan. So in the common black ant, queen lives 30 years, a worker ant lives 10 months. So both of these examples show you just how malleable lifespan is under the influence of selection. We also see plasticity based on conditions. So pretty much any kind of insult you give an organism that it would have been subject to in the natural world actually makes it live longer, which seems counterintuitive. Like, why would starvation make you live longer? Until you understand it in light of the theory, which is in adverse conditions, it does not make sense to reproduce. So take those energy resources and redeploy them to maintenance. Stretch, wait for a better breeding opportunity. If you're a mouse that lives 2 years and you stretch to 1 more season to 3 years, it's a huge difference instead of trying to breed in the middle of a famine. This was the surprising result that Clive McKay and colleagues discovered in the 30s at Cornell when they were working on vitamins and found, actually feeding the rats less make them live longer. That's the chart on the top. That's lifespan data. On the bottom is health span data. Those are 2 rhesus monkeys from the University of Wisconsin. They are the same age. The one on bottom has been caloric restricted. You can see it looks much healthier, and by pretty much any biomarker is healthier. That's recapitulated in humans. So the data on top is epidemiological data from Phelan and Rose, showing an inverse correlation between caloric intake and lifespan in different human populations, and the bottom is health span data to complement the lifespan data. This guy is a crony, a member of the Caloric Restriction Optimal Nutrition Society, before and after starting. You can see he looks much healthier afterwards, and again, by most biomarkers, is much healthier. There's a 4th line of evidence in genetic variants. So this is Cynthia Kenyon's famous paper in DAF2 in worms, where she found a single gene mutation that doubled the lifespan of the worm. Many of these mutations are in nutrient sensing or environment sensing pathways, again tying back to evolutionary theory. That's the data on top. The data on bottom is human centenarian data. So human centenarians are enriched for variants in the same pathway as these worms that live long, showing that there is translation across species for this effect. And then lastly, there's data from pharmacological interventions. So the National Institute of Aging runs something called the Interventions Testing Program. There are a number of agents that have been shown in very rigorous studies to absolutely extend the lifespan of a mouse, of a mammal. The first one is shown in the chart there from Harrison 2009, but a number of others since. And really the only thing on this page that I can't point to you is we've done a long-term trial in humans and shown that we can extend their lifespan. But when you look at this page, there is absolutely every reason to believe that if we were to run that study, we would see that result. Okay, so that's point 2. The science here is real. So you put those 2 things together, there's unbelievable economic value, and there's real science to unlock it, and you say, well, hey, there's a business opportunity here, and that's point 3. There are companies that are starting to realize this. So we're seeing the activity in publication on the first chart on the left going up much faster than the kind of background rate of biomedical research, so 8% versus 3%. In the middle, we're seeing company formation, both number and dollars invested, going up, again, faster than the background rate. And we have some really high-profile examples, right? We've got, on the private side, companies like Calico, multi-billion-dollar, Altos, multi-billion-dollar. On the public side, we have great examples of things like Evolution Foundation, the X Prize, right, where there's real attention now coming into the field. That has ticked up in the last couple of years. So here's charts of media mentions, publications, number of biotechs, dollars invested, and you can see there's a kink, or what I believe is a kink, starting around 2022. We need to get a few more years of data to see, is that just a spike or a kink? But I think a lot of us can feel it as well in terms of the attention that there's a shift now that's happened. That has led to now the case where we've got more than 200 companies with more than $10 billion invested, and a decent size, not a huge, but a decent size clinical pipeline now in clinical trials for humans. And this is arranged by the hallmarks of aging, so the 9 different hallmarks here. There's actually a new version where there's 12, but it's substantially similar. And you can see, okay, there's some hallmarks are getting a little bit more attention than others. And interestingly, when you look at that relatively small pipeline, it's hitting a lot of different disease areas. So we got the columns here are different therapeutic areas, and that is additional evidence in support of the geroscience hypothesis. Again, if you believe this idea that by modulating the rate of aging, you're affecting multiple diseases, you shouldn't be surprised to see that a relatively small pipeline is actually hitting a wide range of therapeutic indications. We're also seeing big pharma move in. So the biggest example is AbbVie's deal with Calico, but you can see there's kind of a long list now of other deals. It's largely through deal making. These companies don't have big internal efforts in these areas yet. There are some small ones. So Novartis has a small internal unit. Regeneron has a small internal unit. So there's the beginnings. But I believe, based on what we've seen, and I'll show a little bit more data on this, the trajectory that we're going to see even more in the next 5 years. And that's going to be my fourth point, which is, so, okay, it's growing. How do I understand? Is that a big size? Where do I stand? Is this a saturated field? Is it too late? So I'm going to do that by comparing it to oncology. So if you believe that longevity plays across a whole range of therapeutic areas, you should think that it's going to be bigger than oncology, which is definitely not the case. There's also a dynamic issue here, right? So as activity starts, it starts with funding. Then academics come up with findings based on that funding, and then that translates into biotechs creating some ideas that are real molecules, and then pharma typically is needed to actually bring those to market. So in a growing field, you're going to see change at the start of this funnel before you see change at the end of the funnel, and that's exactly what we see. So oncology is 10 times the size of longevity in terms of public investment. It's 15 to 20 times the size in terms of academic output. It's 40 times the size in terms of biotech pipeline. And it's more than 100 times the size in terms of pharma direct investment. Now, this is actually good news. It's good news in two ways. The first is that we know the beginning of the snake is going to feed the end of the snake. It's just a dynamic issue. It's going to get there. So you're going to see this activity that is already better at the front of the chain play through. It also means there's a great opportunity, right? We're not saturated yet. If you're an investor looking to get in this field, if you're an entrepreneur looking to start a company, it is definitely not too late. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is what actually happens before the chain that we see here. And I'm a big believer in what drives agency funding, public investment, is public interest, public attention. So where does the NIH spend its money? A lot is on oncology, a lot is on Alzheimer's, and that's great because these are terrible conditions that we absolutely need to be doing work against. But they pay a lot of attention to those conditions because that's where a lot of policymakers ask them to pay attention. And policymakers ask them to pay attention there because that's where the public has a lot of, let's say, emotional attention. We are not yet at the place where people pay a lot of attention to longevity science, geroscience. More than 90% of people say they don't really know anything about it. That's something we need to change. But we actually have a great bully pulpit from which to change that because a lot of people care about lifespan and health span. And so if you start to talk about it in that language, you can get this more noticed. And then ultimately, that drives public attention from policymakers and the rest of the chain. So as an example of this, here's a set of quotes from a study that made headlines about a year ago. The 8 habits that can extend your life by 24 years. This is just a small sample of the number of times it got mentioned. So you probably saw it. If you missed it because you were soundly sleeping or something like that, that's okay because actually, soundly sleeping is one of the 8 habits, so you're at least practicing it. You're probably wondering what they are, so I'll run through them. There's the holy trinity of exercise, diet, and sleep. In exercise, you actually don't have to do that much. The benefits of exercise accrue asymptotically, so even a little bit is worth a lot. So if you're not exercising, definitely start. Don't eat too much, and plant-based diet. I'm sure some people will disagree with me on that, but I'll throw that out there. And then sleep. Then there's the 3 thou shalt nots. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't do drugs, don't have any fun. And then there's 2 around mental health, stress and social relationships. Now, this study was great because it actually is one of the few that I've ever seen that measured a bunch of things simultaneously and quantified them all. So you can get a sense of how important each of these all are. It's all sort of equally important, actually. There's a lot of other things they could have tested. that aren't on this list. We probably all have our list of our favorite, drugs or supplements or cold treatment or hot treatment or, you name it. I'm not going to get into that. Some of those are prudent. Some are, let's say, not so prudent. As an example, maybe of the latter, we do know that eunuchs achieve centenarian status something like 130 times, at least, the background rate. When I showed you the page earlier and I said the only thing that's missing is proof of a human experimental intervention that actually extends lifespan, I lied because this is one. This is not a highly controlled trial, but this is an experimental intervention that's been shown to extend lifespan. So in fact, we already have it. It translates, so if you ablate the germline of a worm, it will live longer. Spayed and neuter pets live longer. It matches theory in terms of allocation of resources. But just to be clear, not something I'm suggesting that you necessarily go out and do. Okay, so 4 key points. So life and health are immensely valuable, somewhere between 367 trillion and infinity. Remember, this is not just an economic point, this is a moral point. That the only way to get there has to be through the Geroscience. Those two facts together mean there's an enormous business opportunity, and it's definitely not too late to get in. So I think I've got a couple minutes for questions. I'm also super happy to connect. Afterwards, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter. Here's my email. So it's a community. I want us to build this community. So very happy to connect with folks here in the room.
Great, Michael. Thank you so much. I've got a question for you. So obviously, BCG, Evolution, you're out there on the global stage speaking with some, I would imagine, some big organizations out there, maybe governments as well. So do you think that governments are starting to get this now? We're seeing some lobbying happening. We see some small groups happening, but I mean, this is a huge demographic problem, and do they get it?
Yeah. So I spend more of my time with the large cap companies than the governments. So let me actually shift your question and just answer from the large caps, like the big pharma companies. Do they get it? So it's absolutely on the radar of those companies, probably because I talked to them about it. You should be thinking about this because this is going to be valuable, and what are you doing now to get ready for it? So I think they tend to be conservative in not jumping in before there's real clinical data, and then once there is clinical data, there's an unbelievable rush. Mm-hmm. And you see this time and time again, right? Once there's a validated target.
Yeah.
That means it's going to happen. And the valuations are going to go through the roof. It's incumbent on us, the biotech, the part of the community right now, to actually get to that point, to that inflection point of where you have proof of concept, shown molecules that are actually showing a therapeutic effect in a phase 2A trial.
So just on that though, because obviously you're at the sharp end of what happens in these cycles, when these assets get to phase 2, phase 2B, and as we know, their regulatory pathway is choosing a disease state. So whichever the big pharma might be, they go, well, hey, we've got this great asset now for cardiovascular disease or whatever it may be. Do these big pharma companies understand the breadth of what they're sitting on in terms of those assets? I mean, we've seen obviously the GLP-1s and how you can start to get wider on the thinking.
So that's the perfect example. So pipeline in a pill is like a mantra among pharma companies. So there's actually a good thing to say, hey, here's a single molecule that can address multiple indications. Now, patent life has a limit, but if you can then do tweaks on that molecule and say, okay, I'm going to use this version for this indication, this version for this indication, so on, you can get around that. GLP-1s are a perfect analog on it. I believe, you see Lilly and Novo show up at these meetings now. I believe they're aware. Those molecules are very likely geroprotectors. We haven't seen the actual data yet in animal models where they've extended lifespan, but I suspect that if you took a GLP-1 and gave it to a mouse, it will extend its lifespan. And what we're seeing in terms of how the GLP-1s are playing out exactly matches that. So yes, they're good for diabetes. Yes, they're good for weight control. Yes, they're good for cardiovascular disease, depending on what your prior diagnoses. Yes, they're protective of chronic kidney disease. Now they're being tested for neurodegeneration, right? You can see exactly the sequence, and like, you know, Lilly and Novo are now the most highly valued, increment in change evaluation pharma companies in the world, and every other pharma company is, you know, trying to get into the same space. Recapitulating that in other fields, I think, would be, very positive.
Yeah, I mean, it will be very positive. And Michael, we actually, because we've got a little bit of extra time, I want to say to everybody, if you have any questions, or does anybody have any questions for Michael, please raise your hand. David, so can we have the microphone, please? Thank you. So just while the microphone's coming over then. So do you feel the likes of Novo and Eli, they're getting into, I think it was the CEO of Novo said they want to get into extreme preventative therapeutics. Do you feel that they understand where this is going? And obviously, short answer, because I'm going to let David ask his question.
Yeah, I know. I mean, so that was the shift. So for a long time, companies stayed away from obesity because worry about reimbursement challenges and so on. That's broken, right? They realize, okay, there's value in prevention, and an ounce of prevention, pound of cure. Like, we all know it, right? There's tremendous benefit from a human's perspective of companies being able to do that. Now, there's still challenges with payer systems, particularly in the U.S., where it's a private market and people stay on their payer only 2 years on average or less. So a downstream benefit for an upfront cost is very hard to justify. Even in single-payer systems, Germany, whatever, you still see an underinvestment in upfront prevention because, well, I have to pay that dollar now, even though it's worth more dollars later. And government coffers have limits. I'm sure Richard could tell us more about this. But look, the case is still there to be made. The value is actually there. So if you find ways to unlock it in ways you move the payments around, you should be able to unlock it.
Okay, great. David.
Michael, Super Talk. I wanted to ask you about one of the companies you highlighted as being a trailblazer, which was Calico from the Alphabet Google stables. And it was 11 years ago. There was so much excitement about it. And many people have said, well, what have they actually done? Can you comment on, is it an example that the pioneers in an industry often don't succeed and they get overtaken? Are there things we should learn from their apparent lack of success? Or is it simply that we need to be more patient and it will take more time?
So I think there's two aspects. I mean, the key word apparent that you, I think, intentionally threw in there, it matters. So one is that this is an industry where time is, the average cycle from very start of idea to actually on market is 17 years. So you can't be too aggressive and waiting, for the results, right? So that's one. Number two is, what we see and what actually is there are different, right? So apparent, there's a number of veils in between there. What I do know is that both Calico and AbbVie seem very happy with the deal. They say they have lots of candidates that have come through. So our perception of it may not match the internal perception of it. I don't know, right? I'm not privy to any internal data there. But I do think it's important to remember what we see and what they see are not the same. Richard?
Yeah, great talk. And there are 1,000 questions, but let me try and focus in on one. You make it sound as if it'll all happen very naturally. I've lived in some of the intersections of that chart that you showed, in particular the one between biotech and pharma. And it took a long time, I remember, for pharma to understand biotech because it had different characteristics. But at the end of the day, the characteristics were you get a drug, the regulators understand it, they give you approval, and you go gangbusters. If we're talking about geroscience, ultimately about the possibility, and that's where the ice may be cracking with the GLP-1 agonists, about something you give people to prevent a whole series of things. And yet we're still stuck, and we had a discussion with one of the great presentations from yesterday, we're still stuck on the lead indication. And unless there's a lead indication, which the regulators understand, then the pharma companies don't move. Can you foresee a time when you will have a geroscience drug which will prevent all of these things? And can the pharmaceutical industry understand that point?
Yeah, can I foresee? Yes. It's not the first step in the chain of how this is going to evolve. I think we need to get there eventually, right? It should be the case that if I can take a drug or some intervention and it's going to extend my lifespan and make me healthier in ways that I can prove statistically, that should be approvable, right? I don't think we need to start there, right? Because these drugs do address the incidence of disease, you can take it from a single disease perspective. We do now there are drugs on market that have been approved, not for single disease, but for a blanket set of indications. Now, okay, it's a little bit of a cheat because it's the immuno-oncology drugs that do a set of oncology indications, but it's a start, right, in that direction. So eventually we're going to go to where you're saying, I think so, but I think it's a red herring for now. People have been complaining about the regulatory environment. I don't think it's necessary. Like, drugs are approved for indications right now. These drugs work against indications, so what's the problem? Use them to prevent the incidence of disease.
One more question here.
That was a great talk. I just have a quick question on, you highlighted the importance of reproduction, and kind of brings to mind that we are dimorphic in nature. And I was wondering if you included or do include that the Holy Grail may or may not be the same for both sexes.
Wow, I think maybe it's between the two. Super point. So in the ITP, the National Institute of Aging Interventions Testing Program, a lot of the agents they've tested actually have different effects by mouse gender. Now, whether that even correlates at all with human gender, who knows, right? Like, if it works in a male mouse, is it more likely to work on a male human or maybe a female? I don't know. And we have no idea why some of these agents work differently in one gender versus another. So there's a whole poorly understood area of science here, which we absolutely have to get underneath. Ideally, you can, one pill will work for both, genders or multiple genders. But if different people need to take different substances, that's also a good outcome. We really don't know enough about the science underneath these sex differences right now. It's a great question. Are different labs looking at different things in the pipeline? So there's a number of academic labs that really do focus specifically on this gender question. Berenice Banyun has really kind of tried to dig in on it. But it is an understudied area, and we really don't understand why we would see the differences that we see.
Great, Michael, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And taking all those questions as well, really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it was great. That's the best part.
Okay, Michael Ringel, everybody. Great.